so I'm going to be talking today about techniques that we've been applying for more than a decade in this basin, trying to construct and grow dense willow habitat. So you might say, grow willow wetland habitat? What would you say? Why is it necessary? Here's the interactive part. Um, so the reason that there's several reasons why it's become necessary in places. Okay, number one, just like many regulated rivers throughout the world, the peak discharges that are needed to overbank the floodplains, to scour vegetation, create safe sites for seedling recruitment, have really been cut off. Cochiti Dam is the main flood control dam on the Middle Rio Grande, and flood peak flows are capped at about 7,000 CFS. A lot of the cottonwoods that you've seen in some of the slide presentations earlier today, where we have old mature cottonwood balsky, they were formed in floods on the scale of about 40,000 CFS. Okay, so things are capped at 7,000 these days. And then you add channelization on top of it. Andrea Hummel, if you saw her presentation, she talked about jetty jacks and other things that were done to channelize the river. It further limits the ability of floods to get over bank. Over the last, over the last 15 years, we've been in really in an extended period of drought or something not good. And we've our peak flows have been even further limited. You know, getting 7,000 out of Cochiti is like a dream. These days, I think we're lucky. We feel like if we're getting 4,000, maybe even 5,000 CFS in a spring runoff event, and you can see, okay, so on the hydrograph here we have a discharge of cubic feet per second. The flows since 2012. Really, the only time that the flows have peaked at about, over 3,000 CFS have been during monsoon events that attenuate very quickly. We haven't gotten snowmelt runoff for, of any substance for quite a while. And why is that? Well, it's 70 degrees out today, so instead of enjoying the beautiful day today, we're in here listening to presentations about why it sucks out there. Okay, the low snowmelt comes off now, okay, and then the higher snowmelt comes off later, and we never really get a peak. So we just get this flat, not much interesting spring snowmelt hydrograph. So I'm sure everybody here knows that the willows and cottonwoods, their seed dispersal evolve with snowmelt runoff. So the fact that we're really getting these peaks in July for a day or two, it's not helping with willow recruitment. So again, this is the story why we're constructing stuff. Now, we've done some mapping over the years up and down the Rio Grande of vegetation, and in 1984 there was a seminal study done by a couple of biologists from Arizona, Hink and Omart, and they mapped the vegetation in pretty good detail, and we looked at their data and compared it with some more recent vegetation mapping and found about a 53% reduction in willow-dominated habitat since the mid-'80s. And having worked up and down the Rio Grande for a long time now, we've seen observationally pretty similar declines. Most of the willow seedling recruitment that we do see is in river bars, basically exposed sediment bars in the channel, and then along a narrow bank line. But that's pretty much the extent of it. Okay, so what do we care about? Willows, right? Well, the southwestern willow flycatcher is one reason, not the only reason, but it's one. And in the Rio Grande, about 80% of the willow flycatchers are breeding in willow-dominated habitat. They might pick a salt cedar to stick their nest in, but the habitat that surrounds it is dominated by Gooding's and coyote willow, Salix exigua and Salix goodingi. And about 85% of the breeding pairs in the Middle Rio Grande Recovery Unit, which goes from the Elephant Butte Delta up about 90 miles, it's all concentrated or mostly concentrated down in the Delta. And that's a great concern to people, not so much from the reservoir pool filling up with water and drowning everything. That's, we wish that could happen, not for the flycatcher's sake, but from the water perspective. I think the bigger thing is channel incision, and as that pool shrinks more and more, and the water table drops, this habitat is considered quite vulnerable. So there's a lot of interest in the basin to try to figure out how do we grow willow habitat and get the bird in more secure locations further upstream outside of the delta. Okay, so we're trying to figure out, since the river's not doing the work in a lot of places, it is in some, but in most places it's not. How do we predictably create willow habitat to help the expansion of the flycatcher upstream? So we started in 2005, we started with some pilot projects with the Corps of Engineers through a project they had at the time called Bosque Wildfires. There were all sorts of fires that were burning down the Bosque, and in some of the burned areas we went in and we said, well, let's try to get some habitat diversity and let's try to grow some willow habitat. And we had collected some data previously that indicated that if the maximum depth to groundwater was about 5 feet, we would be able to, even if non-natives came in, the willows and the willows in particular would still be able to compete pretty well. So we used a general design criteria of, okay, once we clear out the burn debris, let's lower some of the floodplains so that the maximum depth to groundwater is about 5 feet. And then we excavate trenches. I think Andrea showed some pictures like this before, and you can't really see them very well, but basically we just stick dormant coyote willow cuttings and Gooding's willow and cottonwood in these trenches, and then we backfill them. And then a couple years later, in some of the swales, they really fill in nicely. This is a site that's just upstream of the previous one, and this is 5 years after construction. It was incredibly dense. But if you go across the river, this is another site where, it's same time period went by, but not nearly the sort of dense habitat that we're after. So, why such a variable response? And we wanted to understand that so that we could use that information to screen sites for future restoration and also to guide our restoration construction techniques. So the main things that we focused on with the monitoring study were looking at the relationships between willow growth and things like soil texture, soil moisture, and depth to groundwater. And we set up at 5 of the 7 swales that we created, we put in pretty intensive vegetation transects and measured willow cover, height, and stem density, and compared that to the soil moisture, soil texture, and depth to groundwater information that we had. So in a nutshell, what we found was that the tallest willows and the willows with the highest cover were very strongly correlated to soils that had, what we call intermediate levels of fines. So 15 to 25% fines through the soil profile from the surface down to the water table. The willows that had the shortest height, the least amount of cover, were associated with pretty coarse sand. Okay, not much in the way of fines at all, about 5% on average. Interestingly, though, we had some willow swales that had intermediate growth, intermediate cover and height, yet a similar amount of fines is what we found in the swales with the least amount of cover and height. So we looked at our data from at soil water availability, and basically what we found was that even though the sand was similar to where it was the lowest cover and the shortest height, it had higher water. And as we dug into that, it was basically that the groundwater was more shallow in this location. So despite the sandy soils, having a shallower groundwater seemed to make quite a bit of difference in terms of the cover and height of the willows. So we published our findings in Restoration Ecology. I think it was September of 2013 or 14. I don't remember. But the main recommendations that came out of it were, in our screening process for building the next round of willow swales, ideally find sites that aren't just coarse sand, which is pretty tough along a lot of southwestern rivers, okay? But, you know, if you have a bunch of places where you can look around and you have some that have more fine textured soils, especially finer in the way of finer grained sand and some loam, not clay, all right? Then those would probably rank higher for a site selection than if it was just pure coarse sand or gravel. With the design elements, given the information that we found and knowing how we often are going to find fairly coarse alluvium, that we would go, just as a standard rule of thumb, a maximum depth of groundwater of 3 feet. Okay, and incorporate not just lowering the floodplain. Okay, all the other swales that we had done previously, they were isolated from any kind of real direct overbank inundation. Groundwater comes up and down and it'll surface, but it won't overtop the bank line. So we're recommending that you not only lower it to 3 feet, but you also notch the bank line, or you create a backwater channel, something that will allow river inundation and sediment deposition. Fine sediment deposition, we think, is important for improving water holding capacity and the longevity of having moist soil in the feature. A couple of limitations that we felt like needed to be addressed in the next round of monitoring was that we felt like we need to have more continuous measurements of soil moisture at depth increments through the profile, rather than point in time. We'd learn a lot more about how things are changing over the course of the season, especially at different depth increments. And we also feel like getting a better understanding of the actual groundwater dynamics in the swales is a good idea. So we took this information, and Andre was talking about the Middle Rio Grande project earlier. It covers about 22 miles of the Rio Grande through Albuquerque, actually up to from Sandia Pueblo down to the I-25 bridge. It's a big project, $25 million, and there's about 14 of these willow swales created on this project, and they're scaled up. They range from as small as 1.5 acres to about 9.5 acres. And so here's kind of the construction process. Here's an aerial showing these are that's the I-25 bridge crossing, the most downstream end. You can still kind of see the rows, in here, but basically this is all underwater. We have bank line notches through here, so the river, I think the flows were close to 3,000 or 4,000 CFS, and this was completely underwater. And all sorts of nice sediment deposition that occurred. And, oops. Yeah, I thought I had another picture there. Anyhow, so with the preliminary results, we went out on the ground and we verified that for all 40 plus acres of these, that on average maximum depth of groundwater was about between 2.5 and 3.5 feet, depending on which swale. I mean, these were pretty large. These weren't laser leveled fields, so there was some undulating topography in there. So this hydrograph, I think I had shown the bottom part of this earlier. So here's CFS on the left side of the y-axis, and this is depth of the groundwater, the surface being here with this line. And these are the groundwater data from one of the swales, and this is pretty representative of what it looked like. Uh-oh, I better keep cranking here. Anyhow, it was connected well, and it came up above the surface. Everything inundated at the design discharge, and this is only at about 2,000 or 2,500 CFS, so what is probably about the current 2-year return period. And we're getting variable sediment deposition. This was the photo I was looking for. In some places 1/4 inch, in some places it's about 8 inches of sediment deposition. We're getting a decent amount of variability on the ground across a 9-acre area. We'll have some areas where the willow patches are 12 feet tall, other places where they're only about 6 feet tall or 5 feet tall, some places where the root sprouts in between are really dense, other places where they're not. I've got a comparison here with a couple of sites. This one has a direct river connection where we did a backwater channel. This one is isolated, so only groundwater comes up. Look at the difference in the number of root sprouts in the one that's connected versus the one that's not. Also notice the color of the soil. It's a lot more moist. It's got, at this time, a veneer of sediment that was deposited compared to this one that doesn't. It's just groundwater moving up, so it's just sandy stuff there. All right. Groundwater table was shallow at both. There wasn't a big difference at all. You see a little bit more variability in the response where it's connected. The heights were about the same, but where the biggest differences were was we had about twice as many root sprouts in between the planted rows as we did in the one that wasn't connected to the river, and we had half the canopy dieback in the planted willows in the swale that was connected versus the one not connected. We did a pretty intensive pilot study where we collected actually about 3,000 data points across all 14 swales, looking at density, canopy dieback, and the willow heights, and just to get a sense of how important was sediment deposition. You know, a little bit of deposition, no deposition versus greater than 4.5 inches of deposition. You know, basically what we found were the main statistical differences indicated by the different letters really were at the extreme end. So greater than 4.5 inches of sediment, we saw a significant difference in terms of canopy dieback compared to, you know, zero, but any even minor sediment deposition. That seemed to make a difference. Same is true with, for the most part, with the other variables, density and height. But one of the things that we found through the analysis was that even though there was a significant relationship, the regression indicated that sediment deposition really couldn't explain the variability that we're seeing in the data. There's something else going on there. Okay, sediment's important, but it might be a, you know, covariate of something else that's going on. 2 minutes. Okay, so one of the things that we wanted to get an idea was, well, what's happening with root distribution in the soils? Okay, so in the swale with the direct river connection, you can see sort of the sediment deposition there. We noticed also that there was finer textured sand in this swale than there was in this one, the one that wasn't connected. A lot more root biomass, okay, of all different sizes, you know, small, medium, fine roots. This was mostly fine roots, and there was really no sprouts coming up in between. A lot more moist in the top 1.5 to 2 feet. The larger roots were down concentrated at the bottom at about 3 feet where the water table was. So with this data, we're trying to figure out, okay, how can we further refine our design and adaptively manage these projects? So given the information that we've collected so far, our latest set of hypotheses are that the coyote willow foliage density and cover, okay, which are super important for the flycatcher, are strongly related to the rise of the capillary fringe, okay? So the moist soil that is tied to the groundwater table and sort of the osmotic pressure, the sucking of the groundwater table that's related to finer textured soils, okay? We believe that that is a main driver. How high is that capillary fringe above the groundwater table? If it's real sandy, real coarse, it's not going to move as much as if there's finer grained material. In terms of the root sprout density, though, between the rows, we feel like it's surface soil moisture that's more important. All right, so that's our next hypothesis that we're going to be testing. And third is both the canopy cover, the foliage density, and the root sprouting in between are all correlated to groundwater dynamics in the swale. So that all of this stuff should influence how we design these things in the future. Our plan is to test these hypotheses over the next 2 years. The next step after that is compare the willow growth attributes in these swales to sites that are actually occupied by flycatchers. Use the results to fine-tune site selection and design, and then we've got some really great long-term monitoring stations here set up so we can continue to learn, use these as outdoor classrooms so that we can continue to understand what goes on with as climate changes, and maybe we get a good runoff once in a while. Okay, I've used up all my time. Sorry about that.
All right. Do we have any questions? I thought I heard you say that you dug trenches and you laid your plant material in those trenches. Were those trenches parallel to the channel? And then you dug lets to those from the river? Yeah, I call them lets, where you let the water come into the river. Have you ever thought about going from the dig your trenches from the river? In other words, they'd be perpendicular, so the water would kind of capillary into the. You see what I'm saying? You dug your trenches parallel to the river and then let water come in. If you dug your trenches perpendicular to the river and touched the river, then that water could move in. I'm just curious. Have you thought about that?
Notches to try to get, the river to inundate the areas. So, we could cut them, left to right instead of up and down. Yeah. 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 We could do it that way.
So I have a two-part question, Todd. One is, so your ideal depth of groundwater was 3 to 3.5 feet, according to the results you were getting. Was that during the growing season, and was there fluctuations? So what was the low point if it declined during wintertime?
The low point at most of them was 3 feet. Some was 2.5 feet. A couple were 3.5 feet. Maximum depth. So when there was at base flow, low flow in the river.
Okay, good. And then the other question I had was just in terms of as these fines were being deposited and these willows are doing better in finer textured soils, the relationship between salinity in those soils, and were you measuring that impact?
Yeah, that's going to be the next part. We'll be including looking at, the previous swales did not have fine deposition. Now that these do, and we do have places where we're getting a lot of fine deposition, other places where we're not. So certainly increased salinity with time could be a potential problem, and it's definitely something we'll be monitoring. Good question.
A fascinating talk, because a lot of times on the Rio Grande, we have these features that are designed to have the overbank flow, but then they sediment in, and sometimes that's talked about as if it's a problem, because once you get the sediment deposition, you don't have the flow again because you basically blocked that level of flow coming in. I was just kind of curious if there's any way of applying these results to areas where you can't lower the banks enough to get overbank flow.
Well, I think so. One of the things that we're doing right now is using LIDAR to identify sites where the low-set terraces behind the elevated berm that occurs along the bank, right? The vegetation traps sediment and builds a berm, but you might have a low-lying floodplain next to it. Okay, but the flows just can't get over. So those are the kinds of places where you may not need to do much or any excavation if you're trying to grow the willows. So if getting, I think the problem that you were bringing up, though, in terms of sediment building up is that it points out the limited sustainability of much of really what we're all doing. The river can't scour that out again. So, once it fills in, at some point over time, it's going to become disconnected again. So,
thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Todd.